There's something uniquely horrifying about hearing your own bones snap. The garrucha rope goes taut, and Diego Lopez's shoulders separate with two distinct pops, like kindling breaking, as 50 pounds of iron weights jerk his body toward the stone floor of the torture chamber beneath Seville's Palace of the Inquisition. What comes out of his mouth isn't a scream anymore, just animal sound, raw and wet, mixing with the scratch of the notary's quill recording each cry and the hiss of iron heating in the brazier. The smell fills the chamber like a living thing. Fear sweat, yes, but worse than that, the sweet, sick stench of charred flesh where the heated pincers have already done their work, and underneath it all, the smell of human waste, because when pain reaches a certain threshold, the body simply gives up all pretense of control. But 18 hours earlier, this same merchant was tasting his wife's honey cakes in their kitchen on Calle de las Sierpes, worried about nothing more pressing than whether the silk shipment from Bruges would arrive before his son's wedding, completely unaware that the familiars of the Holy Office had already marked his name in their ledgers, already calculated the value of his house, his business, his silver, already decided that Diego Lopez would die screaming so that Spain might profit from his agony. Your history textbook fed you a lie about the Spanish Inquisition. It used sanitized words like religious tribunal and investigation of heresy, as if we were discussing some medieval court proceeding with evidence and witnesses and the possibility of acquittal. It spoke of tensions between old Christians and conversos, as if this were a neighborhood dispute about property lines, rather than systematic state terrorism designed to steal everything a people owned while erasing them from existence. Here's the hidden truth that Spain buried for centuries. The Spanish Inquisition wasn't religious persecution that happened to target wealthy people. It was economic genocide that used religion as camouflage. Between 1478 and 1834, they processed over 150,000 cases, with a torture rate approaching 100%. But those numbers only scratch the surface, because for every converso dragged into those basement chambers, dozens more fled the country, abandoned their homes, or lived in daily terror knowing their turn was coming. The conversos controlled Spain's liquid wealth. They were the bankers who financed royal expeditions, the merchants who traded with Flanders in North Africa, the physicians who treated nobility, the skilled artisans whose workshops filled royal treasuries through taxation. They had committed the fatal crime of being both successful and vulnerable in a kingdom that was bankrupt from endless warfare. Think about what that means. Ferdinand and Isabella didn't care whether Diego Lopez secretly practiced Judaism or genuinely worshipped Christ. They cared that his silk business was worth a fortune and that they could seize it by declaring him a heretic. Every converso family represented a treasury waiting to be plundered, and the Inquisition was their collection agency. But here's why history downplays this story. The Spanish Inquisition operated for 356 years, longer than the entire existence of the United States. It outlasted the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, and Napoleon's empire. By the time it finally ended in 1834, admitting its true nature meant admitting that Spain had spent 3.5 centuries systematically murdering its own citizens for money while calling it God's work. The Catholic Church sealed the records until the 1960s. Spanish historians couldn't access their own archives for 500 years. When scholars finally gained entry, they discovered something that made the medieval reputation look quaint by comparison. The Inquisition hadn't been some relic of the Dark Ages stumbling toward enlightenment. It had been a modern bureaucracy that perfected institutional murder, training professional torturers, standardizing procedures for breaking human beings, keeping meticulous financial records of every stolen estate. They had turned genocide into a science, and the world has spent 5 centuries pretending it was about faith. Picture the world Diego Lopez inhabited in 1475. Seville in the last years before the storm, where converso families like his had spent 3 generations building lives they thought were safe. These weren't recent converts fleeing persecution. Diego's grandfather had embraced Christianity in 1391, nearly a century earlier. His father had fought for Castile in the wars against Granada. Diego himself had never set foot in a synagogue, never learned Hebrew, never observed a Jewish holiday. But in 1470 Spain, your blood remembered sins you'd never committed. The daily routines of converso life had become an exhausting exercise in proving the unprovable. Mercedes Lopez began each morning by checking the street from her kitchen window, noting which neighbors were already about their business, who might be watching, who might be listening. She cooked with pork fat not because she preferred the taste, but because the smell had to drift from their chimney before the church bells rang for morning prayers. The neighbors needed to smell evidence of their Christianity before they started their day. Their daughter Isabel learned to hide the family recipes that had been passed down from her great-grandmother, innocent instructions for preparing certain foods on certain days that might be misinterpreted as adherence to Jewish dietary laws. Mercedes burned the written recipes and made Isabel memorize only the Christian versions, the ones that included pork, that violated every rule their ancestors might have followed. The girl would never taste the foods her great-grandmother had prepared, because remembering them had become a capital crime. In public, the family performed Christianity with the studied precision of actors who knew their lives depended on the performance. When they passed the cathedral, they crossed themselves with visible reverence. When they bought meat, they lingered at the pork vendors, making sure their purchases were noted. When they attended Mass, which was daily, not weekly, they knelt longer and prayed louder than their old Christian neighbors. Every gesture was calculated to demonstrate a faith that had to be constantly proven because it could never be trusted. But here's what made their situation uniquely vulnerable. Diego Lopez was successful. His silk importing business had made the family wealthy by Seville's standards. They owned their house outright, employed 3 servants, wore clothes that announced their prosperity. They had committed the conversos' fatal error. They had money, and Spain needed money desperately. Ferdinand and Isabella's kingdoms were hemorrhaging gold. The wars against Granada had drained the royal treasury. The nobility demanded constant payments to maintain their loyalty. The church required funding for its building projects. But the conversos of Seville had liquid wealth, silver and gold that could be confiscated immediately upon conviction for heresy. They weren't just heretics in the eyes of the crown, they were walking treasuries waiting to be opened. The Limpieza de Sangre laws had made this targeting legal. Purity of blood statutes declared that Christian conversion couldn't wash away Jewish ancestry. Your great-grandfather's religion became your crime. It didn't matter that you attended Mass daily, tithed generously, or raised your children as devout Catholics. If parish records showed Jewish ancestry, you carried hereditary guilt that could be activated whenever the state needed your property. Think about living under that kind of constant surveillance. Your neighbors weren't just neighbors anymore, they were potential informants who might profit from your destruction. The Limpieza laws encouraged denunciations by offering informants a share of confiscated property. A jealous business rival could destroy your family with a single anonymous letter to the Holy Office. Children were taught to watch their parents for suspicious behavior and rewarded for reporting irregularities. The converso community was being systematically turned against itself. Isabel Lopez, at 14, had learned to monitor her own mother's expressions during Mass, to note if Mercedes hesitated before taking communion, if she seemed to pray with insufficient enthusiasm. The girl didn't understand why she felt compelled to watch her mother so carefully, but the cultural pressure was inescapable. Children throughout Seville were unconsciously becoming informants against their own families, trained by a society that had made survival dependent on betrayal. By 1478, the converso community was a population under siege that didn't yet know it was at war. They had wealth that made them targets, ancestry that made them vulnerable, and success that made them visible. They lived in constant fear of neighbors who might denounce them, children who might betray them, and servants who could spy on their most private moments. They were checking for informants in every shadow, avoiding behaviors that might be misinterpreted as Jewish observance, and performing Christianity so vigorously that it exhausted their souls. What they didn't yet understand was that none of it mattered. The performance was pointless, the vigilance was futile. Ferdinand and Isabella had already decided that the conversos would be destroyed, not because of what they believed, but because of what they owned. The Inquisition was coming, and when it arrived, it wouldn't care how perfectly they had performed their Christianity or how completely they had abandoned their ancestors' faith. It would only care how much their destruction was worth. November 1st, 1478. Pope Sixtus IV lifts his pen from the parchment after signing the bull Exigit Sinceris Devotionis Affectus, authorizing Ferdinand and Isabella to establish the Spanish Inquisition. The document is barely dry when riders leave Rome carrying copies towards Spain, but to the conversos of Seville going about their daily business, this is just another piece of papal bureaucracy, another political maneuver in the endless game between Rome and the Spanish crown. Diego Lopez hears about the papal bull 3 weeks later while examining Flemish silk in his warehouse. A customer mentions it casually, the way you might discuss new import taxes or changes in market regulations. Something about investigating heresy, the man says, fingering the blue damask. Probably nothing that affects honest merchants like ourselves. Diego nods and agrees, because what else would you do? Every few years brought new religious initiatives, new regulations, new bureaucratic procedures that mostly affected other people in other places. But this wasn't like other papal bulls. This one included a provision that made it unique in the history of the Church. Unlike previous inquisitions that targeted active heretics, this new tribunal would investigate conversos, Christians suspected of secretly practicing Judaism. For the first time in church history, conversion to Christianity wouldn't protect you. Your ancestry would be your crime. The real trap, though, was hidden in the document's financial clauses. The Inquisition would be funded through the confiscation of condemned heretics' property. Every family destroyed would pay for the destruction of the next family. It was a self-sustaining machine of terror designed to feed on the wealth of the people it devoured. Ferdinand and Isabella hadn't just authorized a religious tribunal, they had licensed a business. Think about what this meant for families like the Lopez household. They had spent 87 years building Christian lives, 3 generations of faithful church attendance, charitable donations, and loyal service to the crown. But the papal bull had just declared that none of that mattered. Their great-grandfather's religion, abandoned before Diego was born, had become a hereditary crime that could be prosecuted at any time the state needed money. The first Edict of Grace arrived in Seville on January 6, 1481, the Feast of the Epiphany. It was read aloud in the cathedral after morning mass, the herald's voice echoing off stone walls as converso families listened in growing horror. They had 30 days to confess their Judaizing and receive mercy from the Holy Office. Those who confessed would face penance and property fines. Those who didn't confess and were later denounced would face investigation, torture, and potential execution. What sounded like mercy was actually a census. Every converso who confessed would have their name recorded in Inquisition files. Their relatives would be listed, their business associates noted, their property evaluated. The Holy Office wasn't offering forgiveness, it was taking inventory of everything it planned to steal. Diego Lopez stood in the cathedral that January morning, listening to the herald's words, and felt something cold settle in his stomach. The Edict of Grace gave conversos 30 days to confess to crimes they hadn't committed in order to receive mercy they wouldn't actually get. It was a trap disguised as an opportunity, and every instinct told him that confessing would be signing his family's death warrant. But not confessing meant waiting for the knock at the door, wondering which neighbor would denounce him first, living each day knowing that anonymous accusation could destroy everything he'd built. The conversos of Seville had been handed an impossible choice between certain destruction and probable destruction, and they had 30 days to choose. The machine was starting to move, and Diego Lopez was standing directly in its path. February 2, 1481. The first arrests begin in Seville, and the machinery of terror starts grinding forward with bureaucratic precision. The Holy Office seizes 6 prominent converso families in pre-dawn raids, their property confiscated the moment the familiars knock down their doors. The official charge is suspected Judaizing, but the real crime is simpler. They own things the crown needs, and now the state has legal authority to take everything. Diego Lopez watches from his bedroom window as the Hernandez family is marched away in chains. Manuel Hernandez had been his business partner for 15 years, a man who attended Mass more faithfully than most priests, whose son was studying for the priesthood. But Manuel's silk dyeing workshop was worth 8,000 maravedis, and the royal treasury was empty again after financing another expedition against Granada. The system of secret denunciations explodes across Seville like an infection. Anonymous letters flood into the palace of the Inquisition, neighbors accusing neighbors of lighting candles on Friday evenings, changing linens on suspicious days, preparing food in ways that might suggest Jewish dietary laws. The Inquisition pays informants a percentage of confiscated property, turning betrayal into a profitable enterprise. Every denunciation is investigated, none is dismissed. The accused never learn their accusers' names. But here's what makes this systematic persecution truly horrifying. It was designed by people who understood exactly how to break human societies. Let me tell you about the medical knowledge they were applying. Medieval physicians believed that physical pain could purify the soul, that suffering burned away spiritual corruption. They thought torture was therapeutic, a medical procedure that would force heretics to confess and save their eternal souls. But modern neuroscience shows us what really happens when you torture someone systematically. Dr. Shane O'Mara, a neuroscientist at Trinity College Dublin who studies the effects of torture on human cognition, has demonstrated that severe physical pain literally rewires the brain. The hippocampus, responsible for memory formation, shrinks under extreme stress. The anterior cingulate cortex, which processes pain and emotion, becomes hyperactive. After prolonged torture, victims lose the ability to distinguish between true and false memories. Their brains begin manufacturing confessions to make the pain stop, creating detailed false memories of crimes they never committed. The inquisitors didn't know they were destroying their victims' capacity for truth. They thought they were extracting confessions, but they were actually creating a feedback loop of false information that justified more arrests, more torture, more confiscations. Every broken victim would name dozens of accomplices, family members, business associates. Each false confession would generate new investigations, new arrests, new opportunities for the state to seize property. The torture chambers weren't producing truth. They were manufacturing evidence to fuel their own expansion. Now let me explain the economics of what was happening, because this wasn't random persecution. Spanish historian Henry Kamen, in his definitive study of the Inquisition, calculated that each major confiscation netted the crown approximately 30 to 40% of a family's total wealth. The remaining 60% was split between the Inquisition itself, local officials, and various administrative costs. Diego Lopez's silk business, his house, his silver, his trade connections, the entire estate would be worth roughly 12,000 maravedis in 1481 currency, equivalent to about $2.3 million in today's purchasing power. Multiply that by thousands of converso families across Spain, and you begin to understand the scope of this economic operation. The Inquisition wasn't just funding itself through confiscations. It was financing Spanish expansion, paying for armies, supporting the royal court, funding Columbus's voyages to the Americas. The wealth stolen from Spain's Jewish population quite literally paid for the conquest of the New World. Every gram of gold taken from the Aztecs was bought with silver stolen from converso families in Seville. But the legal framework that made this possible was perhaps the most insidious element of all. Spanish law traditionally required 2 witnesses for conviction in criminal cases. The Inquisition created a new category called half-proofs: single witnesses, hearsay, rumors, even the testimony of children against their parents. They invented crimes that existed purely in thought: mental Judaizing, the secret desire to practice Jewish rituals. They made ordinary behaviors evidence of heresy. Crossing yourself too quickly suggested you wanted to get Christian prayers over with. Crossing yourself too slowly implied reluctance to perform them.
Imagine this. You're a converso in 1481 Seville. If you're successful in business, that proves you're secretly following Jewish commercial practices. If you're unsuccessful, that proves you're being punished by God for your hidden sins. If you attend Mass enthusiastically, you're overcompensating to hide your true beliefs. If you attend Mass reluctantly, you're obviously a secret Jew. The legal system had become a trap designed to condemn you regardless of your actions. By summer 1481, the converso community was destroying itself from within. Families were fleeing to Portugal, abandoning houses, businesses, entire lifestyles they'd spent generations building. Parents were disowning children who might denounce them. Children were reporting parents to protect themselves from guilt by association. The Holy Office didn't need to arrest everyone. The threat of denunciation was doing their work for them, tearing apart the social fabric of an entire population. Diego Lopez made his fatal mistake in July 1481. A longtime customer, Garcia de Morales, offered to buy his entire warehouse of Flemish silk at below market prices. "Times are uncertain," Garcia explained. "Better to take what you can get while you can still get it." Diego refused the offer. He wouldn't be driven from business by fear, wouldn't accept half value for merchandise he'd paid full price to import. But Garcia de Morales wasn't making a business offer. He was providing Diego with an opportunity to flee before the inevitable denunciation. Garcia knew what Diego didn't, that someone had already named him in their confession under torture. Someone had already signed his death warrant by screaming his name in the basement chambers of the Palace of the Inquisition. Garcia was offering him one last chance to escape. Diego chose to stay and fight. He chose to believe that 40 years of Christian living, that his father's military service to Castile, that his family's charitable donations and faithful church attendance would protect them. He chose to trust in a legal system that had already been designed to destroy him. His wife Mercedes begged him to reconsider. Their daughter Isabel was already having nightmares about the familiars coming to their door. Their son Miguel had stopped attending his lessons because the other children whispered that his family was marked for investigation. But Diego Lopez had built his life on the belief that honest work and faithful service would be rewarded. He couldn't accept that the Spain he'd served faithfully for 40 years had decided he was an enemy to be eliminated. The denunciation came on August 10, 1481. 3 familiars of the Holy Office arrived at dawn with a warrant for Diego's arrest on charges of secretly observing Jewish dietary laws, changing household linens on Friday evenings, and corrupting the faith of other Christians through his example. The evidence came from his former business partner Manuel Hernandez, extracted after 4 days of torture in the Garrucha. Manuel was already dead when Diego was arrested. The man who had accused him had died of his injuries 2 days after signing the confession that would destroy the Lopez family. But death doesn't invalidate testimony given under torture. The legal machinery ground forward, indifferent to whether the accuser was alive or dead, guilty or innocent, truthful or driven insane by pain. Diego Lopez was marched away in chains while his wife watched from their bedroom window. He would never see his home again. Mercedes would lose the house, the business, everything they'd built together. Isabel and Miguel would spend the rest of their lives hiding their ancestry, changing their names, living as refugees in their own country. The machine had claimed another family, and there were thousands more on the list.
Think about this. You're about to hear exactly what happened in those basement chambers, documented in the Inquisition's own trial records. These aren't medieval myths. These are bureaucratic reports, written in careful Latin by notaries recording every scream, every broken bone, every moment when a human being ceased to be human and became something else entirely. August 15, 1481. Diego Lopez receives his summons. 3 knocks at dawn. 2 familiars of the Inquisition and a notary carrying parchment that seals his fate. The charges are read aloud in the street so neighbors can hear. Secretly observing Jewish dietary laws, changing household linens on Friday evenings, corrupting other Christians through his example. Diego denies everything. They tell him he will be examined in caput alienum, under torture, until he confesses the truth. The Palace of the Inquisition contains 3 basement chambers. The first is for interrogation, furnished with a wooden table, uncomfortable chairs, stone walls that weep moisture constantly. The second houses the moderate torture devices, the Garrucha pulley system, the Toca water torture table, iron implements, heating, and braziers. The third chamber contains the patro, the rack that can dislocate every joint in the human body systematically, one turn of the wheel at a time. Dr. Pedro de la Cavalleria, assistant to Tomás de Torquemada himself, conducts the examination. He's a thin man with soft hands who speaks Latin in measured tones, as if discussing theology rather than the systematic destruction of a human being. The notary, Brother Francisco, sits at his wooden table with quill poised, ready to record every word, every confession, every cry for mercy. They strip Diego naked and examine his body for devil's marks, moles, scars, birthmarks that might indicate diabolical influence. They find a small scar on his shoulder from a childhood accident and note it carefully in their records. Even his flesh will testify against him. The questioning begins simply. Do you light candles on Friday evening? No. Do you change your linens on Friday? No. Do you prepare special foods on Saturday? No. Each denial is recorded. Each denial proves his guilt, because heretics always lie. Confession under torture is the only acceptable proof of sincerity. They move him to the second chamber. The garrucha rope is already prepared, hanging from the wooden pulley attached to the vaulted ceiling. They bind his hands behind his back with hemp rope that cuts into his wrists immediately. 50-pound iron weights are tied to his feet. The rope passes through the pulley system, and with a sudden jerk, Diego's body is hoisted until only his toes touch the stone floor. The pain in his shoulders is immediate and excruciating, like fire burning through the joints. His body weight plus the iron stones pulls against ligaments never designed to bear such stress. You can hear the rope creaking under the strain, the wooden pulley groaning, Diego's breathing becoming shallow and desperate as his lungs struggle to expand with his arms pulled behind and above him. Do you observe the Jewish Sabbath? Dr. de la Cavalleria asks calmly. No, Diego gasps. They release the rope. His body drops 6 inches before the rope snaps taut again. The jerk tears through his shoulders like lightning. You can hear the ligaments separating, a wet popping sound like breaking chicken bones. His left shoulder dislocates completely. The scream that follows isn't human anymore. It's animal sound, raw and desperate, echoing off the stone walls and mixing with the scratch of Brother Francisco's quill, recording every detail. The subject cried out upon the second elevation, he writes in careful Latin, claimed innocence. Procedure continued.
They ask again, do you prepare kosher food in your household? Diego's voice is barely a whisper now, his vocal cords damaged from screaming. Please, I am a Christian. I have always been a Christian. Another drop. Another dislocation. His right shoulder separates with an audible snap. The iron weights swing against his legs, opening cuts where the metal edges bite into flesh. After 2 hours on the garrucha, they move to the toca. This is water torture, refined to scientific precision. Diego is strapped to a wooden table, angled so his head is lower than his feet. His arms, now useless, are secured with leather straps. A linen cloth is placed over his face, covering his nose and mouth completely. Dr. de la Cavalleria takes a pottery jar filled with water and begins pouring it slowly over the cloth. The linen clings to Diego's face, sealing his airways. The water enters his nose and mouth in small amounts, not enough to drown him quickly, just enough to trigger the drowning response in his brain. His body convulses against the straps, trying desperately to breathe, to escape, to do anything other than slowly suffocate. The sensation is of drowning while being unable to move, unable to turn your head, unable to do anything but wait for death that never quite comes. Water enters his lungs in small quantities. He vomits repeatedly, aspirating his own bile, choking on the mixture of water and stomach acid that fills his throat. The cloth is removed briefly, allowing him to gasp for air, then replaced, and the process begins again. Confess your crimes and the suffering will end, Dr. de la Cavalleria says gently, as if offering comfort rather than continuing torture. But Diego's brain, oxygen-deprived and pain-shocked, can barely process words anymore. He can only experience the overwhelming need to breathe, the desperate animal panic of suffocation. After 4 hours of toca, something breaks in Diego's mind. The part of his brain that distinguishes between truth and fiction, damaged by oxygen deprivation and extreme stress, begins creating false memories to make the torture stop. "Yes," he whispers when the cloth is removed. "Yes, I lit candles on Friday." The notary's quill scratches across parchment, recording the confession that will justify everything they've done to him. But confession isn't enough. They need names. Who else was Judaizing? Who taught him these practices? Who else in Seville's converso community was secretly maintaining Jewish customs? They move Diego to the third chamber, to the potro, the rack that will extract the information they require. His ankles and wrists are tied to opposite ends of a wooden frame. Ropes pass through a series of pulleys controlled by a large wheel. Each turn of the wheel stretches his body further, pulling his joints slowly apart. The process is methodical, scientific, designed to cause maximum pain while keeping the victim conscious and able to speak. First, the fingers. You can hear the small bones separating as the ropes tighten. Then the wrists, the elbows, the shoulders that were already dislocated hours earlier. Diego's body stretches like a bowstring, joints separating with wet popping sounds that echo through the chamber. His spine begins to elongate, vertebrae pulling apart, nerves stretching beyond their capacity to function. Blood froths from his mouth as internal organs shift and tear. His breathing becomes shallow, rattling, as his ribcage expands beyond its natural limits. But he's still conscious, still able to speak, still able to provide the names they want. "Your brother-in-law," Dr. de la Caballeria suggests helpfully. "Surely he taught you these practices." Diego's mind, desperate to end the torture, seizes on the suggestion. "Yes," he gasps, "Fernando taught me." Another name for the Inquisition's files. Another family marked for destruction. "Your business partner, Garcia de Morales, he was involved as well?" "Yes, Garcia too." The lies flow easily now, his brain manufacturing false memories as quickly as the Inquisitors can suggest them. Garcia de Morales, the man who had tried to warn him, who had offered him escape, is now condemned by his own victim's tortured confession. Diego Lopez gives them 17 names, 20 families who will face the same ordeal he has endured. 17 sets of children who will watch their parents dragged away in chains. The machine feeds itself, each victim providing fuel for its continued operation. On the 6th day of torture, Diego's heart stops. The notary records the time carefully. Died during examination at the hour of vespers. The cause of death is listed as heart failure brought on by examination of conscience. His body is burned as a relapsed heretic. His family receives a bill for the firewood. December 30, 1481. The first auto de fe takes place in Seville's public square, and the smell of burning flesh drifts across the city like incense at a perverted mass. 6 living prisoners and the remains of 13 dead conversos are burned, while thousands watch as if it's entertainment. Children throw stones at the flames. Vendors sell roasted nuts and wine to the crowd. Death has become spectacle, and spectacle has become profitable. Andrés Bernaldez, chaplain to the Archbishop of Seville, watched from the platform reserved for clergy and left us this testimony. "I saw them burn many people, and their property was all confiscated for the king. All the city was afraid, because there were very few families, especially among the wealthy, without some member who was of that lineage." Even the witnesses understood they were watching the elimination of an entire population. What Bernaldez didn't record, but what the Inquisition's own medical consultants noted in their reports, was the specific way human bodies respond to systematic torture. The 17 people Diego Lopez named in his confession before dying all showed identical patterns of psychological breakdown when brought for their own examinations. They confessed immediately, often to crimes they couldn't possibly have committed, sometimes providing details of Jewish rituals they had never learned because their families had been Christian for generations. Modern trauma research explains why. Dr. Judith Herman, the psychiatrist who pioneered our understanding of complex PTSD, has documented how torture doesn't just destroy the body, it fragments the mind's ability to distinguish between reality and fiction. When the Inquisition tortured Diego Lopez until he named his brother-in-law Fernando, they weren't extracting hidden knowledge. They were watching his hippocampus, already damaged by days of extreme stress, manufacture false memories to escape unbearable pain. This is why the Inquisition's confessions were so remarkably detailed and consistent. Victims weren't remembering actual Jewish practices. Their tortured brains were creating elaborate false narratives based on suggestions from their interrogators, who would helpfully propose specific crimes during the examination. The torture chambers weren't revealing a hidden network of secret Jews. They were manufacturing evidence of a conspiracy that existed primarily in the fevered imaginations of broken minds. Mercedes Lopez never recovered from watching her husband's arrest. Contemporary medical records from the Hospital de las Cinco Llagas show she was treated for what physicians called melancholia, uncontrollable weeping, inability to eat, episodes where she would stare at walls for hours without speaking. Modern psychiatry would recognize these as classic symptoms of severe PTSD and major depression triggered by witnessing extreme trauma. She lost everything within a week of Diego's death. The house on Calle de las Serpes was sealed and its contents inventoried for sale. The silk business was dissolved, its trade contracts transferred to old Christian merchants at below-market prices. Even her jewelry, her mother's silver candlesticks, the wedding gifts that had marked their prosperity, everything was confiscated as fruits of heretical activity. The Inquisition's financial records, preserved in the archive of Simancas, show the Lopez estate generated 8,247 maravedís for the royal treasury, enough to fund a military company for 6 months. Isabel and Miguel Lopez disappeared from the historical record after their father's execution. Church registries suggest they fled to Portugal with their mother, joining the thousands of converso refugees who abandoned Spain rather than face the systematic destruction of their families. They changed their names, abandoned their inheritance, lived as exiles in their own homeland. They never returned to Seville. But the most chilling testament to the Inquisition's efficiency came from Garcia de Morales, the man who had tried to warn Diego, who had offered to buy his silk warehouse as a cover for escape. Garcia was arrested 3 weeks after Diego's execution, condemned based entirely on Diego's tortured confession. Under examination, Garcia provided 32 additional names of supposed conspirators. Those 32 arrests generated 127 more denunciations. The machine was feeding itself, each victim's broken mind providing fuel for its continued expansion. Garcia de Morales died after 8 days of torture, but not before generating enough accusations to keep the Inquisition busy for 2 years. His last recorded words, according to the notary's transcript, were, "Forgive me, Diego. I tried to save you." Even in his agony, he understood that his friend's torture had doomed them both. By 1482, entire neighborhoods in Seville stood empty. The Juderia, where converso families had lived for generations, became a ghost quarter of abandoned houses and shuttered shops. Property values collapsed as no one dared buy homes that might carry the taint of heretical association. The silk trade, once dominated by converso merchants like Diego Lopez, transferred entirely to old Christian hands. An entire commercial network, built over centuries, disappeared in less than a year. The psychological impact spread far beyond the direct victims. Dr. Kai Erickson's research on collective trauma shows how entire communities can develop shared symptoms of hypervigilance, anxiety, and social fragmentation when exposed to systematic violence. Seville's remaining converso population displayed all these markers: constant checking for surveillance, inability to trust neighbors, children who stopped playing in streets where arrests had occurred. The Inquisition had achieved something unprecedented in European history. They had weaponized an entire society against a segment of itself, turning neighbors into informants, children into spies, business relationships into potential death sentences. They had created a culture of terror so pervasive that people policed themselves, eliminating the need for constant surveillance by making everyone a potential surveillant.
Within 6 months of Diego Lopez's death, the Holy Office had collected enough denunciations to keep their torture chambers operating for the next 5 years. The machine was self-sustaining now, feeding on the confessions it extracted, growing stronger with each family it destroyed. The death of one silk merchant had generated enough accusations to eliminate hundreds more. And the most horrifying aspect? It was working exactly as designed.
The Spanish Inquisition didn't happen because a few sadistic priests decided to torture people in basements. It happened because an entire society, from the royal court to village priests, from wealthy merchants to common laborers, actively participated in the systematic destruction of their neighbors. The machinery of genocide requires thousands of willing hands, and Spain provided them enthusiastically. Ferdinand and Isabella didn't just authorize the Inquisition, they designed it as a profit center. Royal account books from the archives of Simancas show that confiscated converso wealth funded the conquest of Granada, Columbus's voyages to the Americas, and the construction of royal palaces. Spanish expansion into the New World was built on stolen Jewish gold. Every gram of Aztec treasure was purchased with silver seized from families like the Lopez household. The Catholic Church provided more than religious justification. Local parishes supplied the Inquisition with baptismal records to verify ancestry, creating genealogical databases that tracked Jewish bloodlines across generations. Priests preached sermons declaring that impure blood carried hereditary sin that could infect entire communities. They blessed torture chambers and provided chaplains to comfort torturers, not victims. The Church transformed neighbor-against-neighbor surveillance into a religious duty. But the most insidious complicity came from ordinary citizens who discovered that persecution was profitable. When the Holy Office auctioned confiscated property, bidding was fierce. Diego Lopez's silk warehouse sold for 60% of its market value to Garcia Mendoza, an old Christian merchant who had been unable to compete with converso trade networks. His house on Calle de las Sierpes went to the city's tax collector, who had always coveted the property. Mercedes Lopez's jewelry was distributed among the wives of Inquisition officials as compensation for their service. The farmers who sold grain to feed prisoners in Inquisition jails, the carpenters who built burning platforms for auto de fe, the blacksmiths who forged torture devices, the servants who cleaned blood from stone chambers, they all profited from systematic murder while telling themselves they were serving God. The Inquisition created thousands of jobs, from professional torturers to funeral pyre attendants. Genocide became an industry. Imagine this. Children throughout Seville were taught in schools that reporting suspicious behavior by converso families was a patriotic and religious duty. Teachers offered rewards for students who informed on Jewish-seeming practices they observed in neighbors' homes. Parish priests announced from pulpits that anonymous denunciations could be submitted after Sunday Mass. The Holy Office printed standardized forms listing warning signs of secret Judaism that citizens should watch for in their communities. The legal system transformed justice into theater designed to justify predetermined conclusions. Spanish law traditionally protected property rights and required substantial evidence for criminal conviction. The Inquisition created parallel courts where accusation equaled guilt, where torture was legal, where property could be seized upon arrest rather than conviction. They established that heresy was hereditary, that Jewish ancestry carried genetic guilt, that conversion couldn't wash away the sins of blood. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of institutional complicity was how quickly the system spread beyond its original targets. After perfecting their methods on conversos, Ferdinand and Isabella turned the same machinery against converted Muslims, the Moriscos. Between 1609 and 1614, they expelled over 275,000 Spanish citizens using identical techniques: anonymous denunciations, property confiscation, systematic torture, mass deportation. The bureaucracy of persecution was so efficient it could be adapted to eliminate any population the state deemed problematic. Why did it work so well for so long? Because the Inquisition understood something fundamental about human psychology.
People will participate in atrocities if you make participation profitable and non-participation dangerous. Every Spaniard who bought confiscated property became invested in the system's continuation. Every neighbor who submitted a denunciation became complicit in maintaining a structure that rewarded betrayal. Every priest who blessed the proceedings became a guardian of institutional murder. The popular myth claims that most Spaniards were horrified by Inquisition excesses but powerless to stop them. The historical record tells a different story. Contemporary chronicles describe enthusiastic crowds at public burnings, competitive bidding for confiscated goods, celebrations when prominent converso families were destroyed. The Inquisition was popular because it enriched ordinary people at the expense of a vulnerable minority. This wasn't medieval barbarism stumbling toward enlightenment. This was systematic state terrorism operating with modern bureaucratic efficiency. The Inquisition kept detailed financial records, trained professional interrogators, developed standardized torture procedures, maintained comprehensive databases of suspect bloodlines. They perfected techniques that would later be studied and adapted by every totalitarian regime in human history. The Spanish Inquisition worked because Spanish society wanted it to work. It redistributed wealth from a successful minority to the Christian majority. It provided religious justification for economic persecution. It created a culture where betrayal was rewarded and loyalty was suspect. It turned an entire nation into accomplices in the systematic elimination of their own citizens. When you hear someone say the Inquisition was the work of religious fanatics operating outside normal society, remember this: it required the active participation of farmers and merchants, teachers and tax collectors, carpenters and clergy, parents who taught their children to spy, and neighbors who profited from denunciation. It wasn't the exception to Spanish Christian civilization, it was the logical conclusion.
The Spanish Inquisition operated for 356 years, from 1478 to 1834, longer than the entire existence of the United States. By the time it finally ended, it had eliminated nearly all traces of Jewish life from Spain. Synagogues had become churches. Hebrew books had been burned. Even the memory of Sephardic culture had been criminalized. An entire civilization, built over 8 centuries, had been systematically erased. 1492 was the year everything crystallized. After perfecting their system on conversos like Diego Lopez, Ferdinand and Isabella ordered all practicing Jews to convert or leave Spain immediately. The Edict of Expulsion gave them 4 months to liquidate their property and depart. An estimated 165,000 Jews fled, taking only what they could carry. Spain lost its most skilled artisans, traders, physicians, and intellectuals overnight. The kingdom that had been Europe's most prosperous became an economic backwater within a generation. But the techniques didn't disappear with the Jews. Between 1609 and 1614, Spain turned the same machinery against the Moriscos, converted Muslims who had remained after the conquest of Granada, using identical methods: anonymous denunciations, property confiscation, systematic torture. They eliminated another 275,000 Spanish citizens. The bureaucracy of persecution was so efficient, it could be adapted to destroy any population the state deemed problematic. The psychological scars ran deeper than the economic damage. Spain developed what historians call a culture of suspicion that persisted for centuries. The limpieza de sangre statutes, those purity of blood laws that had doomed families like the Lopez household, weren't fully abolished until 1865, longer than American slavery lasted. Spanish society remained obsessed with genealogy, with proving Christian ancestry, with maintaining the fiction that bloodline determined loyalty. Even the language carried the infection forward. Spanish developed dozens of words for different categories of suspected heretics: converso, marrano, cristiano nuevo, judaizante. These terms became hereditary marks of shame passed down through generations. Children in 1700 were still being taunted with epithets describing their great-great-grandparents' religion. The Inquisition had poisoned Spanish identity itself. 1834 marked the formal end, But not because Spain experienced a moral awakening. Liberal revolutionaries abolished the Inquisition because they needed its vast accumulated property to fund their government. The last auto de fe had occurred in 1826, not from lack of suitable victims. Spain had finally succeeded in eliminating everyone the Inquisition was designed to destroy. The international consequences were equally devastating. Spanish techniques of systematic persecution spread across Europe like a contagion. The Portuguese Inquisition, established in 1536, used Spanish methods to eliminate conversos who had fled there seeking safety. Italian states imported Spanish interrogation procedures. Even Protestant nations studied Inquisition torture manuals to refine their own methods of religious persecution. The financial records tell their own story. By 1800, the Inquisition had confiscated property worth approximately $2.7 billion in today's currency. That wealth, stolen from Jewish and Muslim families, funded Spanish colonization of the Americas. Every Spanish church built in Mexico was constructed with silver stolen from converso merchants. Every Spanish fortress in Peru was financed by gold confiscated from families like Diego Lopez's. But perhaps the most enduring legacy was institutional. The Spanish Inquisition created the blueprint for modern state terrorism. Secret police, anonymous denunciations, torture to extract confessions, property confiscation to fund operations, public executions to terrorize populations. These techniques were studied and refined by every totalitarian regime that followed. Stalin's NKVD used methods pioneered in Seville's torture chambers. Nazi Germany's confiscation procedures were based on Inquisition legal precedents. The Sephardic diaspora carried their trauma across the globe. Converso families who fled to the Ottoman Empire, to North Africa, to Amsterdam, preserved languages, customs, and memories that Spain had tried to erase. They maintained communities in exile for 5 centuries, never forgetting the homeland that had expelled them. Their descendants still carry surnames that originated in medieval Spanish villages, still speak Ladino, still remember recipes that Mercedes Lopez would have recognized. 1968 brought the first official acknowledgement of what had been done. At Vatican II, the Catholic Church finally condemned religious coercion and admitted that forced conversion was morally wrong. It had taken 487 years for the Church to admit that the Spanish Inquisition violated Christian principles. 2015 saw Spain pass legislation offering citizenship to descendants of expelled Sephardic Jews. The response was overwhelming. Over 127,000 applications in the first year alone, proving that Sephardic identity had survived 5 centuries of exile. Families with roots in Diego Lopez's Seville, in Mercedes Lopez's kitchen, in Isabel Lopez's childhood were still out there, still carrying the memory of what Spain had done to them. The most chilling aspect of this legacy is how completely the Inquisition succeeded in its primary goal. It wasn't designed to save souls or purify faith. It was designed to steal wealth and eliminate populations while making the theft appear religiously justified. By those measures, it was the most successful program of ethnic cleansing in European history before the 20th century. When you visit Spain today, you won't find monuments to the conversos who built its prosperity. You won't see plaques marking the houses where families like the Lopez household lived before their destruction. The Juderia de Seville is now tourist attractions with no mention of the families who were tortured to death in nearby basement chambers. But the DNA analysis doesn't lie. Modern genetic studies show that up to 20% of the current Spanish population carries Sephardic Jewish ancestry. The Inquisition failed to eliminate Jewish blood from Spain. It only succeeded in making people forget they carried it.
La Inquisición never ended. It just changed its name, updated its techniques, and found new populations to destroy. When modern democracies use enhanced interrogation techniques, they're employing virtually identical methods to the toca water torture that broke Diego Lopez in 1481. The psychology is unchanged. Inflict unbearable pain to extract confessions, then use those confessions to justify the system that produced them. Think about how states eliminate unwanted populations today. First, they criminalize the group's wealth. Nazi Germany's Aryanization program seized Jewish businesses using legal procedures copied directly from Inquisition property confiscation statutes. Soviet collectivization eliminated kulaks by declaring their prosperity evidence of counter-revolutionary activity. Every modern genocide begins by making the victim's success their crime, exactly as Ferdinand and Isabella did with Spain's conversos. The surveillance mechanisms are identical too. Anonymous denunciation apps in authoritarian regimes work precisely like the Inquisition's secret informant networks. Citizens report suspicious behavior by neighbors, children inform on parents, business rivals eliminate competition through strategic accusations. The technology changes, but the psychology remains constant. Make everyone a potential spy, and society polices itself. Look at how modern torture apologists justify their methods. They claim it extracts vital information, saves lives, protects national security. But current interrogation science proves what the Inquisition demonstrated 5 centuries ago. Torture produces false confessions, not reliable intelligence. When the CIA waterboarded suspects at Guantanamo, they weren't gathering actionable intelligence. They were repeating the same mistakes Spanish inquisitors made when they tortured Diego López until he named innocent people as conspirators. The most chilling parallel is how ordinary citizens participate in systematic persecution while maintaining their defending civilization. Spanish neighbors who bought confiscated converso property at below-market prices told themselves they were supporting the church's holy mission. German citizens who acquired Jewish businesses during Aryanization claimed they were protecting assets from communist seizure. American communities that remained silent during Japanese internment insisted they were ensuring national security during wartime. What would you have done if you lived in 1481 Seville? Would you have bid at the auction when Diego López's silk warehouse was sold? Would you have submitted an anonymous denunciation about suspicious behavior you observed in converso neighbors? Would you have sent your children to schools that taught them to spy on Jewish families? Would you have attended the auto de fe where Mercedes López's husband was burned alive? Most people assumed they would have resisted, but the historical evidence suggests otherwise. The Spanish Inquisition was popular because it enriched ordinary Christians at the expense of a vulnerable minority. It provided religious justification for economic persecution. It created a culture where betrayal was rewarded and tolerance was dangerous. Sound familiar? Modern persecution operates through the same mechanisms: economic incentives for collaboration, legal frameworks that criminalize targeted populations, cultural narratives that dehumanize victims, and systematic silencing of anyone who questions the process. The Spanish Inquisition succeeded because Spanish society wanted it to succeed. Every subsequent genocide has followed the same template. The persistent myth claims that systematic persecution happens because evil leaders manipulate innocent populations. But the Inquisition's records tell a different story. It required enthusiastic participation from farmers and merchants, teachers and tax collectors, parents who taught their children to inform, and neighbors who profited from denunciation. The machinery of genocide doesn't work without millions of willing hands. When you hear politicians declare that certain groups threaten national security because of their ancestry, remember the limpieza de sangre laws that made Jewish blood a hereditary crime. When you see communities competing for confiscated assets from targeted populations, remember the auctions where Diego López's property was distributed among his former neighbors. When you watch children being trained to report suspicious behavior by minority families, remember Isabel López learning to spy on her own mother. The Spanish Inquisition's techniques didn't disappear in 1834. They were studied, refined, exported, and adapted by every authoritarian regime since. The bureaucracy of terror, the transformation of neighbors into informants, the use of torture to manufacture evidence, the seizure of property to fund state violence, these didn't die with the last auto de fe. They're still operating today, in places you might not expect, using methods you might not recognize, targeting populations you might not defend. The only difference is that now we have no excuse. We know exactly how these systems work, exactly where they lead, exactly what they cost. The question isn't whether it could happen again. The question is whether you'll recognize it when it does.
But what was that sound again? echoing through the stone chambers beneath Seville in August 1481. It was the sound of Diego Lopez's shoulders separating as the Garrucha rope went taut. It was the sound of the Spanish state learning that terror worked. It was the sound of neighbors discovering they could profit from their neighbor's destruction. It was the sound of the church blessing torture chambers while calling it God's work. It was the sound of children being trained to spy on their own parents. It was the sound of an entire people being systematically erased while the world watched and learned. But listen more carefully to those screams echoing through history, because they didn't stop in 1834. They echo through every secret police station, every enhanced interrogation facility, every place where states torture their own citizens and call it security. They echo through every auction where confiscated property is sold to eager buyers. They echo through every anonymous denunciation submitted by neighbors who profit from betrayal. The Spanish Inquisition never ended. It just found new names, new targets, new justifications. The Garrucha became waterboarding. The secret denunciation became the anonymous tip line. The limpieza de sangre became genetic profiling. The auto de fe became enhanced security measures. They said it was for God. They said it was for Spain. They said it was for purity. They said it was for security. They said it was for the greater good. But the screams tell a different truth. The screams tell the truth of greed masquerading as righteousness. The screams tell the truth of neighbors betraying neighbors for profit. The screams tell the truth of societies that choose comfortable complicity over difficult resistance. The screams tell the truth that Diego Lopez learned in those basement chambers. When the machine comes for you, it doesn't matter how faithful you've been, how loyal you've proven yourself, how perfectly you've performed your identity. All that matters is whether your destruction serves someone else's profit. And the most terrifying truth of all, the machine is still running.
La Inquisición Inquisitoria's techniques didn't vanish in 1834, they evolved. When you see anonymous denunciation systems praised as public safety, when property confiscation is justified as national security, when populations are criminalized for their ancestry, remember Diego Lopez. What would you do if the familiars came to your street? Would you bid at the auction when your neighbor's property was confiscated? Would you recognize the machine before it's too late to stop it? The screams from those basement chambers are still echoing. The question is whether you're listening.